Greetings and welcome to the 16th episode of the podcast series English Sovereigns. In this episode I shall be talking about another brief reign, that of King Edmund II, otherwise known as Ironside. Edmund inherited the throne in April 1016 when his father, King Ethelred, had died. Edmund was the third of 6 sons, but the 2 elder brothers had died before he did, and indeed before their father did, so Edmund was able to inherit. However, the inheritance was not a great one because Cnut, who was the son of Sven Forkbeard, had been ravaging the country, especially up north, and the Witan had actually supported Cnut as well. So the Witan were the body of noblemen and councillors and representatives throughout the realm, who actually in Anglo-Saxon England had the final say on who became king. So they actually proclaimed Cnut the king, but Edmund was in London at the time, and the people of London, citizens of London, that's a mouthful of a word, proclaimed him as king and indeed crowned him, which is why we would count Edmund, because he was in fact crowned, and some nobles supported him anyhow. Edmund did eventually leave London to raise an army, and he won the support of Wessex, so it was a kind of a fight back in a divided England again, and he managed to come back and relieve the siege of London, which had happened whilst he'd been away, and actually inflicted some defeats on the Danes at the Battle of Brentford, and indeed at Otford, but when the chips fell down, Edmund was decisively defeated at the Battle of Assendon in October. And in the resulting peace deal, Edmund was allowed to keep the kingdom of Wessex, and Cnut was allowed to be king of the rest of the country. Now, it's not clear whether Edmund was a sub-king of Wessex, in a similar way that we had in the first few kings of Wessex, or he was genuinely the king of Wessex and it was his own independent nation, and Cnut was the king of the rest of the country. We can't quite be sure. But anyhow, this didn't last long, and Edmund died in December of 1016, allegedly on the toilet. He might have been murdered, or equally he might have just died of a disease sustained in battle. Whatever, Cnut was the main beneficiary of his death, for it allowed him to absorb Wessex and therefore keep England as a united entity, and further consolidate that national identity that had been sort of brewing over the last 100 years since England was a thing. That was pretty important. I think if you're going to assess Edmund, I mean, his reign is obviously quite short, but in comparison to his father, he was certainly a better king. He didn't do much ruling, but he did lots of military commanding, and Edmund was a fighter. His moniker, Ironside, is literally a reference to the fact he was clad in armour all the time, and he was a greatly respected and admired military commander. This was in fact corroborated and demonstrated by Cnut visiting the grave of Edmund a year after Edmund's death. Now, that might have been for propaganda purposes just as much, but it shows that Cnut did respect his opponent. So I guess you should give credit to Edmund for that, but ultimately he failed in his ambition to keep the kingdom, although I think arguably it's probably too late to keep the kingdom intact, given Cnut was ravaging the north and got most of the country under his thumb by the time Edmund actually acceded the throne. So really you can blame Ethelred for Edmund's lack of success in retaining the throne. Anyhow, that is the end of this episode. I will see you for Cnut's episode from 1016 to 1035. Thank you very much.